The relentless South Carolina sun, at the zenith of a summer day, baked the dusty roads of the small town of Alcolaa, as if burning away the last vestiges of life. The year was 1944. The world was consumed by the fires of war, with millions perishing somewhere in distant Europe and across the vast Pacific. Yet here, in the very heart of America, on its own different front, an equally poignant and tragic story unfolded. A story poisoned by the venom of racial hatred and blinded by deafening injustice. The story of George Stinney Jr., a black boy, who at the time of his monstrous execution was a mere 14 years old. He became the youngest person ever sentenced to death in the United States. Alcolaa, a town where time flowed slowly, yielding only to the changing seasons and the unhurried rhythm of agricultural labor. Here, on a humble farm where poverty and grueling work reigned, lived George Stinney Jr. with his family. George was an ordinary boy, though he displayed a responsibility uncharacteristic of his age. His days were filled with study, helping his parents in the vast cotton fields, and playing with his younger brothers and sisters. His bright eyes, full of lively curiosity, and his slightly tousled dark hair painted a picture of childhood carefree abandon that war seemed unable to touch. But the world young George inhabited was steeped in invisible walls of segregation and prejudice, walls that separated black and white. These barriers seemed far more solid than stone, and as unyielding as the laws of nature themselves. The summer of 1944 brought not only heat, but profound sorrow. On one stifling June day, not far from the modest dwelling of the Stinney family, a terrible, unthinkable drama unfolded in a small cottage. The lives of two white girls, 11-year-old Betty June Bingham and 7-year-old Mary Frances Smith, were extinguished. Their lifeless bodies were found inside. The brutal and inexplicable murder shook the quiet town to its very core. In those times, when racial prejudice was not merely commonplace but the bedrock of social order, and when crimes committed by African Americans against white people ignited a special, irrational panic, the first shadows of suspicion naturally fell upon the black residents. George, along with his sister Emma, like many other children from their community, was carelessly playing on that fateful day not far from the very house where the terrible tragedy had occurred. Perhaps they accidentally witnessed something suspicious, or perhaps they simply found themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time, becoming perfect candidates for the role of scapegoats. Investigators, driven by haste and the desire to appease the public as quickly as possible, to present at least someone, began their interrogations. The children were the first to fall under suspicion, and it was at that very moment, in that terrifying atmosphere of general fear, chaos, and unhidden racial pressure, that the tragedy of George Stinney Jr. began to unfold. The air in Alcolaa seemed literally saturated with tension. People whispered, their faces contorted by a mixture of fear and anger. Every gaze directed at their black neighbors seemed filled with the deepest suspicion. In times like these, when justice was often but a pale shadow of true fairness, and legal aid for African Americans was practically inaccessible, the boy's fate was, alas, sealed. George, still a very young child and not fully understanding what was happening around him, was torn from his usual carefree life. He was taken for questioning, leaving his parents in the dark, without any legal representation. The officers likely resorted to intimidation, and a child's psyche, unable to withstand adult pressure, began to crack. A confession, that was the word that became George's sentence. He confessed to the murder of the girls. However, the exact circumstances under which this confession was obtained remain a subject of intense debate to this day. Were there threats? Or perhaps, was he promised release? For a 14-year-old boy, finding himself in a hopeless situation Alone with powerful adults, such questions might have seemed secondary compared to the single, all-consuming desire to go home. His mother, Mabel Stinney, desperately tried to protect her son. She was absolutely certain of his innocence. She knew for a fact that on that fateful day, he had been home, right beside her. But her voice, like that of many other black residents of Alcolaa, was merely a tiny drop, sinking into an ocean of widespread outrage and passionate demands for justice. Justice, which it turned out, had a specific skin color. The trial, if it could be called a trial at all, swept through like a storm. The defense, entrusted to a lawyer rumored to have very little experience and no opportunity for proper preparation, proved powerless against the prosecution's onslaught. Sufficient evidence was not gathered, and witnesses, including George himself, gave contradictory testimony, with some of their words being taken out of context and distorted. George himself, throughout this entire nightmare, tried in vain to retract his statements, but it was already too late. The prosecution, bolstered by his own confession taken out of context, sounded incredibly convincing to the jury, composed exclusively of white men. The verdict was unanimous: the death penalty. For a 14-year-old boy, a world that had known war now also learned that the most brutal battle could unfold within its own borders, fueled by hatred and prejudice. Following the pronouncement of the sentence, the Stinney family was overcome with despair. They pleaded for clemency, penned letters, and desperately tried to prove George's innocence, but the doors of justice remained stubbornly shut. The atmosphere in Alcolaa no better. The verdict instead poured fuel onto the flames, solidifying in many hearts an unwavering conviction in the righteousness of their actions. In his prison cell, George seemed resigned to his inevitable fate. During his last meeting with his parents, he appeared at peace, even finding the strength to comfort them. Perhaps he was simply weary of the endless struggle. He was tired of being misunderstood, of the fear of a world that felt so alien and hostile to him. The 16th of June, 1944, on that fateful day, George Stinney Jr., surrounded by silent prison guards, was led to the death chamber. He wore a new shirt, provided by the state like a final farewell garment. When offered a hood, he firmly refused. He wanted to see the faces of his executioners, to see the light, even in this final, most terrible moment. The sentence was carried out. Dehydration. The death of George Stinney Jr. was not the end of the story, but rather the beginning of its long, agonizing reflection. For years, this story remained in the shadows, forgotten or deliberately silenced, hidden from public view. But the wound of injustice did not heal. Decades later, at the dawn of the 2000s, a new movement began, dedicated to reviewing this case. Lawyers, historians, journalists, and activists whose hearts were touched by the struggle for civil rights embarked on a meticulous examination of the case files. They searched for new evidence to prove George's innocence. Testimony that had previously gone unnoticed was discovered, evidence suggesting the real killer could have been a completely different person. A monumental effort was undertaken to understand how such a thing was possible, how the justice system could have allowed such a monstrous mistake. The psychological aspect here is key. Fear, deeply ingrained biases, and sometimes collective hysteria, intertwined with the flaws of the legal system, particularly concerning minority representatives, created the perfect conditions for this tragedy to unfold. For many years, George's family lived with this unbearable pain, the pain of loss, the oppressive sense of hopelessness. But hope, even the most fragile, had not died in their hearts. And then, almost 60 years after that tragic execution, in the year 2014, the South Carolina State Court finally overturned the unjust verdict against George Stinney Jr. It was a belated, but so crucial acknowledgement of a monstrous judicial error. The family's defender, lawyer Stephen Scott, emphasized that this was not just a rehabilitation of young George's name, but also a symbolic exposure of the deep-seated racial prejudices that had caused this horrifying tragedy. The death of George Stinney Jr. is more than a regrettable judicial error. It is a grim mirror reflecting humanity's darkest aspects and societal flaws without embellishment. It's a piercing story of how all-consuming fear, blind prejudice, and an insatiable desire for a swift conclusion can warp the very essence of justice beyond recognition. This is a tragic narrative about the fragility of a child's life, left defenseless against an adult world mired in violence and blatant injustice. How many more Georges have prematurely vanished, their desperate voices ruthlessly silenced? How many more innocent souls have suffered simply for the color of their skin, their social standing, or sheer misfortune? Being in the wrong place at the wrong time. These questions, like unhealed wounds inflicted by the past, remain open, reminding us again and again. The story of George Stinney Jr. is not merely a dry chronicle of a real crime. It is an insistent call for unwavering vigilance, for an active fight against all manifestations of prejudice, and for an unyielding, most sincere pursuit of true, just law. For only by deeply comprehending past events